There are two countries in the world that are often held up as examples of what not to do. Two countries that for a long time seemed able to conquer the world, but which have been undergoing chronic crises for decades. Crises from which they seem to not be able to escape. You know which countries I'm talking about? One is Argentina. That's easy. The other is 18,000 kilometers away and is none other than Japan. Of course, this doesn't mean that these two countries are the same, not at all. The fact is that whenever a developed country has problems, Japan always appears as an example of what not to do.
Europe's remedies for Japanization. Weak growth and slowing inflation could have Europeans afraid of repeating Japan's mistakes.
Perhaps, folks, the person who experienced the most negative aspects of Japan's decline in recent decades was Emperor Akihito, who abdicated the throne on April 30th, 2019.
Bandai! Bandai! Bandai!
Allow me to explain. Japan's emperor has no real power, and Akihito's reign was a particularly unlucky one. When he came to the throne in 1989, Japan seemed ready to take on the world. That same year, Japanese company Sony got a major foothold in Hollywood by buying Columbia Pictures. Mitsubishi's real estate division got the Rockefeller Center itself. Japanese companies were investing everywhere, and all forecasts indicated that the Japanese economy would surpass even the US economy within a few years. However, in just 3 years, everything fell apart. The Japanese bubble exploded, and the Tokyo stock market collapsed, and the crisis spread throughout the Japanese financial system. The years of strong economic growth, they had ended forever. Since 1991, the average economic growth has been only 0.9% a year. Public debt has increased from 50 to 236% of the GDP. It was China that snatched second place in the largest economies in the world. Japanese companies lost ground, and Japan was left out of the top positions in the Great Internet Revolution. The cost of this decline? Strenuous working hours of 12 hours or more are still common. Japanese workers barely enjoy 10 days of vacation a year, and wages are even lower than 3 decades ago in real terms. And that's not all. The last 3 decades haven't only been bad from an economic point of view, they have also been very rocky in political terms. Japan has had 17 prime ministers from 5 different political parties in the last 30 years, which is pretty insane. And as if this wasn't enough, during Akihito's years, the birth rate has been low, which has resulted in an aging population. The country has faced disasters such as the tsunami and the Fukushima nuclear accident of 2011, not to mention the North Korean threat. Now you might understand why they say that Emperor Akihito had bad luck. But hold on a second. When we think of Japan, it's not just the crisis we think about. There's manga, sushi, car brands like Toyota. So, well, are things really that bad in Japan? But what if I told you that things haven't been as negative as they seem? What if Japan were somehow starting to shine once again? In this video, we've decided to look at some of Japan's best features. We're also going to look at a social revolution that is stealthily taking place that could set a benchmark, or at least provide an experiment for the rest of the world. So listen up.
The best side.
Japan has been having a bad time for 3 decades. It's been stuck in a kind of stagnation that it cannot overcome. Yet despite this, their numbers, they're still pretty good. Obviously, it won't surprise you when I say that Japan is still a very wealthy country. We all know that. But the question is, how rich, or rather, how prosperous is the country of the rising sun? Well, folks, we could say that Japan is still one of the top 20 countries in the world where households have the most income after taxes. With $28,641, Japan is at the level of countries such as Denmark, Finland, or the Netherlands, and is above the United Kingdom, New Zealand, and Ireland. It's also one of the 5 or 6 countries where, on average, families have the most financial assets once their debts have been deducted. It also has one of the highest life expectancies, is one of the safest countries, and has one of the best educational levels. In the PISA index, Japan is just behind Singapore. In R&D, research and development, more than $150 billion are invested every year, ranking them the third highest country in terms of levels of spending and the fifth highest when you compare the amount spent to their GDP. Japan comes in just below South Korea, Israel, Sweden, and Taiwan. And folks, even though they have the highest public debt in the world, no less than 237% of the GDP, it really isn't as serious as it seems. The Japanese government has several debts, yes, but it also has a lot of financial assets, and if you take these into account, its net debt is decreased to only approximately 150%. You should never only count what you owe, but also count what you have. And that's not all. The government's main creditor is the central bank, which in a way means that the entire debt has already been shared among the Japanese for the last 3 decades. For example, with a lower financial return, with a good part of the capital going into public hands due to the central bank purchases of assets, and with less real wages. In any case, the entire debt is in the hands of the Japanese, so to speak. Japan has no external debt. It isn't a debtor. In fact, it's quite the opposite.
Japan, China, and Germany, world's top creditors. Japan kept its position as the world's largest creditor nation for the 22nd straight year last year.
And unlike other countries, their companies aren't linked to the debt either. Look no further than the Tokyo stock market, the 4th largest stock market in the world, where 60% of the companies have no net debt. Seen this way, in spite of all of the country's problems, because they do have them, things don't look so bad, do they? And what's more, in recent years, between 2007 and 2017, a curious development has taken place. You see, the Japanese economy is barely growing, that's a fact, but its population is shrinking and its economy has no inflation. The real growth per capita, which ultimately determines the level of well-being, has risen to equal the growth rate of the US and is ranked above countries such as France and the UK. Surprised? Well, you shouldn't be. This has been largely driven by the Asian continent's economic explosion. After all, Japan has neighbors such as China, Vietnam, and India, where, for example, Suzuki, a Japanese car company, accounts for just over 50% of the entire Indian car market. We're talking about billions of potential customers here. Want another example? Well, look at what happened with tourism. You see, traditionally, Japan has had very few tourists, mainly because of its distance from other developed countries. However, in recent years, it's become quite the theme park. Japan has the largest growing tourist arrival rate in the world. Within a short time, and largely thanks to Chinese visitors, the number of foreign tourists has gone from just over 6 million in 2011 to over 31 million in 2018, and forecasts say that this figure could exceed 60 million by 2030. Obviously, all of this means a lot of new jobs, but its population is the oldest in the world and is, in fact, reducing every year. So how can they fill all of these new positions? Well, folks, that's where the social revolution promoted by the Prime Minister Shinzo Abe comes into play. And listen up, because Japan is becoming an experiment on how to deal with demographic aging. And I think their solution is probably going to surprise you.
The social revolution.
Okay, something is very clear for Japan. In such an old country where the population is expected to decrease significantly during the upcoming decades, only productivity and investment in technology and robots can save them. But dear viewer, this takes time, and of course, to be able to invest as much as they need, they have to become a prosperous economy. So the question is, how can a stagnating economy recover and keep public finances under control while the population ages at full speed, especially when you consider what an aging population means in terms of pensions and health spending? Well, the Prime Minister believes that it's essential to increase labor participation in the short term, raise the percentage of people who work, and that's precisely what is happening in Japan. But have you noticed this? How are they managing to increase the number of workers in a country if the population is both shrinking and aging at a rapid pace? So what is Japan doing to solve this problem? Well, folks, the answer is that Shinzo Abe is leading a social revolution in Japan, obviously with less demanding jobs and shorter shifts. This has led to more than half of all Japanese men aged between 65 and 70 going back to work. This is more than double the average in the OECD countries, which includes almost all of the most developed countries. Have you ever seen the movie The Intern with Robert De Niro? Well, it's kind of something like that.
面白い夏休みしよう
On the other hand, the government is also promoting a historic increase in female labor participation, which in Japan has not traditionally been very high. Japan is experiencing a huge transformation. The number of women working and occupying leadership positions is growing. This change has been driven by what has become known as womenomics. This is a policy that, for example, has increased daycare services, incentivized part-time contracts, and encouraged companies to adjust their schedules to the needs of women with children. This is how Japan has become one of the countries with the greatest percentage of working women today. However, the truth is that despite all these measures, the Japanese economy still needs many workers. In fact, there are so many vacancies that there are currently more than 150 jobs for every 100 candidates. Yep, you heard that right. There are more jobs available than candidates. Many more. That's why in recent years, Shinzo Abe has been demolishing what has been for so long a taboo in Japanese society.
The arrival of new blood.
Since time immemorial, Japan has been one of the countries most closed to immigration in the world. We already talked about this a while ago on VisualPolitik. In Japan, the immigrant population accounts for only 1.8% of the total. This is one of the lowest percentages, if not the lowest percentage, in the entire developed world. However, that's changing.
Japan to Asia. Give us your young, your skilled, your eager workers.
Since Shinzo Abe came to power in 2012, the number of foreigners has doubled. And that won't be the end of it. In December 2018, Japan approved new laws to boost the arrival of immigrants.
We need to break free of conventional thinking. I will create a Japan that can attract great talent from around the world.
Folks, the new regulations make allowances for two new statuses for the foreign population. On the one hand, a very appealing status to attract the most qualified workers who can settle in Japan practically indefinitely with their families. On the other hand, there's a new status designed so industries can bring in less qualified workers. Here, the conditions are more limited, but even so, the new regulation seeks to eliminate all the problems and the bad conditions that these foreign workers have typically suffered, something that we already talked about in another video. In any case, folks, Japan has many problems, and we've talked about them many times, and we intend to do so in the future. But there are also reasons it can remain one of the richest countries in the world. So I really hope you enjoyed this video. Please do hit that like button if you did, and don't forget to subscribe for brand new videos. Also, don't forget to check out our friends at the Reconsider Media podcast. They provided the vocals in this episode that were not mine. Also, this channel is possible because of Patreon and our patrons on that platform. Please consider joining them and supporting our mission of providing independent political coverage. And as always, I'll see you in the next video.